Okay, so thanks a lot. Thanks for inviting me to this conference. I'm going to talk about income inequality, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about sort of a broader context of inequality. I'm going to throw at you nothing less than sort of my view of how the world works and how economy sort of enters into that, and in particular how inequalities enter into that. So there's a couple of things that Terje said that I want you to pay attention to. One of them, which I think is particularly important, is the notion that it's possible to disentangle or distinguish between opportunities and outcomes, because, as you very correctly point out, at any starting point, we have a distribution of stuff, and that starting point, that's the opportunities of anyone. And so you'd think that, okay, so you make choices then, and what those choices are, those are your responsibility. But in particular, when it comes to kids and just about anyone, you're always affected by what happened previously. So that's an important point, I think, because many discussions have a tendency of going in this direction of should we focus on outcomes or opportunities, and I would say that it's really hard to distinguish the two, or even impossible. Okay, I'm also going to let's see how this works. I'm going to be a bit sort of lectury and teachy about different measures of this, and my apologies to those of you who are very familiar with this. In my defense, I can say that I've been working on this topic for quite some while now, and I find it useful to remind myself all the time of what is it exactly what we mean when we talk about certain things. How is it that we measure these things? And the reason why I bring this up is that I think it's really important to keep in mind that you can measure inequality at so many different levels, and then you can come up with all sorts of comments about inequality is going that way, or poverty is increasing, or it's decreasing, or it's bad now, it was better before. And all of these things have to do with what exactly is it that you're talking about, and how do you measure this? So these are important things, not because they're techie details, but because if we genuinely want to understand what's going on, we need to pay attention to these details. Okay, so first of all, on that point, there's, I don't have to say this, you're all here, because I presume an interest in the inequalities. That interest is out there a lot more now than it was 20 years ago when I started working on this. It's talked about often that inequality is moving in that or this direction. But the question is, what is inequality really? And here I'm going to restrict myself to economic inequality, and in particular, income inequality. I'm sure the connection between this and health and other outcomes is going to be talked about a lot in this today and tomorrow in this conference. So another thing is that it's been sometimes suggested that, hey, you're an economist, you shouldn't be meddling in inequality because that's a political question, or it's a philosophical question. What on earth could economists possibly, say about inequality? So I strongly, unsurprisingly, disagree, and I would claim that economics has always been about distributional issues. It was by David Ricardo in the 1800s. It was called the principal question of political economy. What is the distribution between labor and capital, and all these things? And another nice way of phrasing it is that quote up there that, the two greatest ends of economic inquiry is really answering two questions. One is why, when we look globally, does it seem that some communities or some countries do better than others? And then the second question, if we look within each place, no matter if they're doing well or poorly, we see tremendous inequalities within each place, right? And we can take this at any level. We can look at any disaggregation that we like. We always see differences in outcomes. So it's a big issue, you know. Why is this? How does this come about? But still, even if we can have that overall understanding, we want to know inequality of what, right? So we can think of this in terms of income, wealth, or resources more broadly, or opportunities. We can also think of this in terms of sort of market outcomes or disposable incomes. I'll come to exactly what this means. But also it's important to think about between whom. Is it between individuals or is it across households? Are we concerned with inequalities between men and women, between young and the old? Or, you know, there's a number of ways we can slice this as well. Another thing which is really important and also often comes up, I'll only briefly comment on this, is over what period? Because it's been suggested that, you know, we can have increasing inequality when we measure incomes at each point in time, typically over a year, you know, yearly incomes. But then maybe this is just reflecting that people's incomes have become more volatile, that, you know, there's more movement. So inequality, if you look at this over several years, maybe is not increasing at all. Now, it turns out that the short answer to that is that it's true that mobility is important and people do move back and forth in the distribution. But this does not explain the increase in inequality, because mobility is roughly the same over this period when inequality has been increasing. And we can also think about what different kinds of measures to use. At what, you know, we can have overall. How many people here can define a Gini coefficient? Yeah, okay. How many people know what a Gini coefficient is? You know, is a high number good or bad, or, you know? Okay, so most people have some idea, right? But this is typical, I think, for the discussion, that we have different ways of measuring this, and we don't really pay a lot of attention to exactly what is it that we're looking at. So, and then, of course, the classic poverty. What is poverty? And do we talk about absolute poverty or relative poverty? So paying attention to this explains how you can have these seemingly contradictory. I've taken some of these points that I think come up a lot in the debate. So one thing is global inequality is decreasing. That's, you know, postered in certain outlets. You know, fantastic news over the past 30 years. Global inequality is decreasing. At the same time, somebody else posts, global inequality has actually increased in most countries. Now, how on earth is it possible for both of these things to be true at the same time? Because they are. Well, simply because people talk about different things. The first, inequality has decreased, is talking about, imagine the whole world, you know, the John Lennon version, imagine there's no country kind of world. And then you line up people from poorest to richest. In that sense, in that distribution, inequality has decreased, simply because a lot of poor people, their incomes have grown more than many of the, globally speaking, rich, but in the Western context, poor. The very poor globally, their incomes have grown more than incomes for many people in the rich world. So in that sense, inequality is decreasing. But at the same time, it's also true that within countries, inequalities are increasing in most countries, at least most OECD and Asian countries. It's a bit different in Africa and South America. And then you can have the same thing about poverty, for example, that absolute poverty for similar reasons is in fact decreasing, but relative poverty has gone up, and especially in the OECD countries. Now, what is important? Which should we pay attention to? Well, that actually depends on the question you're asking. It doesn't, there's no way of defining this in some way so that we can get the right measure or the right way. You just have to pay attention to what is it that I'm wondering, and then accordingly define things. So how do we measure this? This is my stylized version of the economy, how things work. So here's a crash course in 45 seconds of economic growth theory. We imagine in a stylized fashion that there's all these people, right? They start with some kind of endowment. Now, they make decisions, and those decisions result in some production. This production is a function of labor and capital. That's econ talk for people's working efforts and all the stuff we have around us. That's the capital. It's like buildings, infrastructure, all that kind of stuff. Based on this, out comes values. That's what economists measure when they measure GDP or some other measure of this. And a lot of that is actually the basis for incomes in the economy, individual incomes. So what you fill out in your tax forms, that comes from this. And depending on where you are in this distribution, the very pedagogical size of the arrows here means that some people get more, both of the labor, and some people get more of the capital income. And this results in a distribution, right? But then people form households. And there's taxation and redistribution and stuff going on, okay? And so based on this, and there's also government provision of goods and things. And based on this, people save and consume, and so it goes around. That's how the economy works. Now, up there, we have wealth inequality, or inequality in resources in some sense. Here, we have market outcomes. That's when people talk about wage inequalities or something like this. And here we have what I will mainly talk about, or when I show you figures of inequality developments, that will be in disposable incomes. And this is important, that step, right? Because disposable incomes, that means taking into account the living conditions of people and how many people are there in the household. So you use the household as the income unit, right? But then you divide the money that comes into the household to each individual, including kids in the household, right? Because if you look at market outcomes, what does it mean that a kid is poor? Kids don't work, so they all have zero, right? But we want to know what kind of conditions they live in, so we look at the household. And another thing that comes out of this, and which is important, and Terje also touched upon this a little bit, that depending on who in that lineup ends up living with whom in the households, that alters, the picture. Because if it's random across the distribution, then you have some equalization going on, because some poor people live with people with high market outcomes, and that sort of evens out. But if people start to all, in the top of the sort of market outcome distribution, they all form households together, then inequality increases just as a function of different household formation. And that, in fact, is part of what's been going on. Okay, so how do we now measure this? What are the different measures? Well, one way is to line up all these people from those with the lowest incomes to the highest incomes. And then we divide this into what we often call percentiles. And then we can form ratios, for example, between the person standing at the 90th percentile and the 10th, or the person standing in the middle. And if say the P90 over P10 ratio, if that goes up, that means that either the P10 guy has reduced their income relative to P90, or the P90 guy has increased, right? But the key thing here is that you can have that measure move both based on the P10 guy falling and the P90 guy increasing, or a combination of both, right? You can also look at the income share of, say, some top group. This is what's been very popular when people talk about the, we are the 99%. That means we are the people who don't get what the 1% gets. And the 1% turns out get a lot more now than they got before. So that's a different way of measuring this. Or you can then have these summarizing measures like the Gini coefficient, for example. And again, unsurprisingly, what you should look at depends on what your question is. But a key thing here is also that often you want to look at several measures. Okay. How am I doing on time? Not so good. Yeah, no, that's the story of my life. I'm always late. What has happened in the Nordic countries? Well, this has happened in the Nordic countries. So this picture here is the Nordics. That's some other OECD countries. The fact that these are sort of not aligned is not because I can't get them aligned, but because the scale here is in fact such that it starts at 1820 here, and that scale starts at 2426. So putting them like this shows you what the levels are actually like. So this illustrates that it's been increasing in the Nordic countries, but in a way so that we're still quite a bit below, say, the UK and US in terms of income inequality. But we're approaching some kind of OECD average in this. So this is starting from 1990. This is a picture over the 20th century. This is the top one income share, but I could draw you similar pictures for other measures, and it would still be true that, broadly speaking, there's the Nordic countries down here. Then there's one dotted line, which is France. France represents continental Europe. And then there's the US, sort of up there. And this shows what is globally true over the 20th century, that we have tremendous decrease of inequality, which in the 60s, 70s goes further in the Nordic countries. The Nordics become exceptional. Right? And now what's going on is that we're approaching some kind of OECD average. So, what do we make of that? Well, I don't know. But it's a fact that this is what the longer term perspective looks like. Another thing is that we see real income growth in all parts of the distribution. All of these pictures, by the way, are disposable incomes. So compared to many other countries, incomes have grown more in the Nordic countries, but they have grown unevenly. So that's a different way of saying what the previous picture said. So what are the main reasons? Okay. This is, of course, very broadly speaking. But so I could go on for ages about each point and qualify them, but I don't have time for that, so you'll have to do with the short version. One thing is that, in general, in the Nordic countries, low incomes have lagged behind because of various public insurance systems and transfer systems. Typically, unemployment sickness benefits have not kept up with wage increases. That's a big reason for why low incomes have lagged behind. Top incomes have gained a lot, mainly due to capital incomes becoming more important. And capital incomes are way more concentrated than other types of incomes. And as I was hinting before, household composition has changed in a way that increases disposable incomes. So mainly due to more single households and older population. A fourth point, which is about what has not happened, is that increased wage dispersion, so changes in the wage distribution, is not a big factor in the Nordic countries. And why is that important to point out? Well, because it's the main reason for why income inequalities have increased in the US, for example. So a lot of the debate is influenced and informed by what's going on in the US, because a lot of research is done on the US. And there, the story is technological change has increased in such a way that, has changed in such a way that those with high education get a lot more. That is not true in terms of wage dispersion in the Nordic countries. Now, one last point, if I may, or will you bear with me for a couple of minutes? I'm only eating into your, coffee time, so it's nobody else. 3 minutes, okay. So one very important thing is in the disposable incomes, we only look at the incomes, including transfers, but those are direct transfers to households. We don't include the value of, say, schooling or the healthcare system, broadly speaking. So what if we take in public service, which is a big thing in the Nordic countries? How much does this change the picture? So this is a graph where the red bars are Gini coefficients for what is called extended income, and the blue bars are the ones in cash income. So yeah, it's true that the Gini coefficient drops, so inequalities are reduced when we take into account access to schooling and healthcare and these things. But it doesn't change the fact that inequalities have grown, and it doesn't really alter the ranking of countries all that much. But what it does change differently for different groups is that the red, again, are the extended income. So these are poverty measures, shares of the population in poverty. Up there for singles with no kids. So for that group, including value of public service doesn't really reduce poverty measures all that much. The second graph at the far right, that's poverty for people with single parents with kids, so single parents. So there you get quite a lot of reduction. So it seems that something's going on in terms of what the public system provides that reduces poverty for that group. And finally, here we have age 75 and above. Here, poverty almost disappears, measured in this particular way, when you include the value of the public health system, basically. So cash income-wise, there's a lot of poverty, but once you include the value of public health, then traditional measures of poverty are reduced. So the bottom line is, the public system has a large effect, but that effect can be very different in different points of the distribution. Now, I had a lot more interesting stuff to say, but you guys all want coffee, so I'll just have to, Thanks for listening. Thanks.